Hi everyone, it's Jill Foster here for Penny Black with a new Positively Penny Black video. And during these difficult times, we are committed to bringing our followers some positive messages of inspiration, art, crafting, distraction, and sharing. So let's go ahead and get started on today's card. Here's a look at what we will be creating. And today's card focuses on techniques that can be used with our brushstroke stamps. And our brushstroke stamps are simply stamps that once you stamp them down, it looks like you just sat down and hand painted a beautiful image. They do not stamp an outline that you color in, but rather you can color directly onto the stamp to add the color. Now before we begin, I wanted to mention I will have a full supply list on screen up at the end of the video, so if you want to check that out in more detail, just hit pause at that time. And I have some tips for you today as we will be making this card. The first is when you're using our brushstroke stamps is to try different papers. Different papers are going to absorb more of your ink or allow more of it to sort of sit on the surface and be moved around. So I am using some Bristol Smooth paper for my stamping today, and that allows more of the ink to sort of sit on top of the surface of the paper, giving me more time to blend that using my paintbrush after I do my stamping. I also think it keeps the color nice and vibrant because rather than being absorbed down into sort of the fibers of the paper, it sits on top and dries that way in a little bit brighter way. So to start with, I'm coloring directly onto my stamp using water-based markers. These are Arteza Real Brush pens, and you can use any of your water-based or water-soluble markers for this technique, such as Tombow dual brush pens, Zig markers, distress markers. And I started by coloring some yellow onto all of the leaves, and then I'm going back with a darker green and coloring that on, but not coloring it quite as far up as I did with the yellow, so that the very tips of the leaves, especially those larger ones at the bottom, will keep some of that yellow there, just for some variation. I also knew I was going to add the butterfly that comes with this stamp set in some yellows, and I wanted that to tie into the stamping of the flowers. So I've colored my leaves and now I'm moving on to the flowers. Now I can take my time in coloring these. Of course the video is sped up, but when you're coloring these you can take your time because we are going to mist this with water before we stamp it. And that will reactivate, sort of recharge all of that ink that we've added to the stamp. And that's why using a water-soluble marker is important, so that that can happen when you mist it with water. So I've added a lighter blue and then a darker blue down towards the base of these petals. And I almost forgot the one up here at the top, but I'll go ahead and grab that now. Then I'm going to lightly mist this with water and stamp down. Now, you could certainly stop right now and you will see that this is beautiful just as is, but another tip you can do if you want to take this a little bit further is to add some additional blending with a paintbrush before that marker ink is dry. So after I stamp that, I just have a very damp paintbrush. I've dipped it in water and patted it on a paper towel, and I'm just blending out a few of those areas where the paint sort of pooled up onto the paper. Now again, like I said, you could just stop right here. I think this looks very beautiful and very soft, but I've decided to do some additional detail stamping on this just to show you different ways that you can work with the stamp. So another tip I have is to re-stamp with a mini ink pad that allows you to capture more details. And this is really helpful if you over mist your stamp. So if you spray and when you're done stamping it just looks like blobs of color, don't worry, you can go back and add some additional details. This also can be used, like I wanted to darken up these leaves, so I am inking them using an archival mini ink pad. The mini size just allows me to get it just onto the leaves instead of all over the whole stamp. And I'm applying it just more towards the base of the leaves and just restamping a few times, and you can see where that just added some extra depth and darkness to the leaves. I'm going to do the same thing on these flowers, just add a little bit of a darker blue down at the base. I kind of turn that ink pad so I'm using the corner of the ink pad to ink up the stamp. And that just adds a little more deep detail and a little more depth to the stamping. Now here I'm going to work on the butterfly, and I'm going to follow the same steps that I did for the flowers, but this butterfly is going to be a great example of what happens if you overmissed, and not to panic that you can fix it. So I'm putting my layers of color, the lightest color, the medium, and the darkest, and then a darker color here on the body of the butterfly. And then I am going to mist this just a little too much. So you'll see here after I stamp this, I am going to do some additional blending with a paintbrush before it's dry. This is going to let me soak up some of the ink that is just too blobby, too much that's on there. Kind of spread it around more into a butterfly shape. But I certainly was not happy with that. So on the flowers, I could have stopped after the first impression and not done any more details, but the butterfly was not as great. So don't worry. This happens to everybody. If this happens to you, you do not need to be done. So before I do my restamping with a mini ink pad to capture more of those details, I am going to make sure everything is dry. The paper is dry and that my stamp has been cleaned off and dry, so that I'm not just continuing to stamp into puddles, so to speak. So I'm going to ink this up here with my lightest yellow ink. Already it's looking more like a beautiful butterfly. And then I'm going to add just towards the center of the butterfly a little bit darker color. Again, all the exact colors will be up on screen at the very end of the video. And you can see starting to look more and more beautiful. And I'll just use that marker without misting to get the body of the butterfly. Now it is helpful to have that sort of layer of watercolor underneath that we did have before we added that marker or that ink pad inking on there. So now one more tip is you can restamp or add more shading with the marker directly to the paper. And after I had that butterfly up there, I just wanted more yellow on these leaves. So I'm just taking my marker and just coloring right onto the leaves and blending it down into the green. And it's so simple, but it just gave me a little more control of that color on the leaves. And to finish this off, this is my go-to card layout for brushstroke stamping, is to finish it off with a masked and inked background. I swear it seems like this works every time to just finish the cards. You can have fun stamping it, and then you know you have a plan to create a card you're going to like in the end. So I have put down a mask. I just cut this mask using one of our frame dies and used the negative piece that was left over. And I taped it down with some painter's tape, and I'm using some Memento inks and an ink blending tool with a foam pad on there to just lightly sponge some ink. I'm focusing mainly around the perimeter, right along the edge of that mask. You can see I've used this several times. You can save it from card to card. And I'm trying not to go over too much of the stamping and leave a bit of a white glow in the center of the card. I've used some blue, some green, and some brown on this, just for some interest on the background. You can also, if you want more of a vintage look, just do sort of that rich cocoa or that brown color. You don't have to do a colorful background. It's really up to you. You can play around with the different looks that you want to add with your inking. So I love the reveal when you take that mask off. And then all you need to do to finish off your card is to stamp your sentiment. And for my sentiment on this card, I'm using one from our Magical Friendship Transparent Set 30-707. And I've just positioned that down there by that flower and underneath the butterfly. So there you can get sort of a close-up look at that stamping and inking that we've done. And here is a look at the finished card. This is a standard A2 size card, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I thank you so much for watching today. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you receive a notification each time we post a new video. And we also invite you to fill up your feed with our Facebook, Instagram, and our blog posts, which are filled with all things happy. And I've linked to all of these for you down in the YouTube description box below, along with the stamps that I've used on today's card. And here, as promised, is the full supply list. Thanks for watching.